Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of Perceptive Learning Zone. I'm your host, mentor Hamza Nasser, and today we'll be talking about the implications of the United States' recent attack on Venezuela. A lot of people have described this. There was a report on Al Jazeera that said it is the erosion of the United Nations Charter as well as the normalization of aggression. The United States attack on Venezuela on the 3rd of January, it should be understood not simply as an unlawful use of force, but as part of a broader shift towards nihilistic geopolitics in which international law is simply subordinated to imperial management of global security. Now, what is at stake over here, fellows, is not only Venezuela's, I would say, sovereignty, but the collapse of any remaining confidence in the capacity of the United Nations system, and particularly the permanent members of the Security Council when it comes to restraining aggression, preventing genocide, or upholding the core legal norms that they claim to defend. The military intervention, its political aftermath, and the accompanying rhetoric of US leadership, it together exposes a system in which legality is invoked very selectively, where veto power substitutes for accountability and coercion, well, it replaces consent. Venezuela thus becomes both a case study as well as a warning, not of the failure of international law, but of its deliberate marginalization by those states which are entrusted with managing global security. I would say, from the standpoint of international law, this action is constituting a crude, brazen, unlawful, as well as unprovoked recourse to aggressive force. It is in clear violation of the core norm of the UN Charter, Article 2, Bracket 4, which reads, and I quote, that all members of the United Nations shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, unquote. The only qualification to this prohibition is set out in Article 51, which says, and I quote, nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations, unquote. Now, this flagrant violation of Venezuelan territorial sovereignty and political independence, well, it was basically preceded by years of United States sanctions, weeks of explicit threats, and recent lethal attacks on vessels that were allegedly transporting drugs, as well as seizures of tankers that were carrying Venezuelan oil. This unilateral action now, it was further aggravated by the capture of Venezuela's head of state, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife Celia Flores by US Special Forces, reportedly guided by the CIA, in order to face charges of narco-terrorism in a US federal court in apparent violation of sovereign immunity. Now, this imperial posture, openly disregarding the immunity of foreign leaders, it was underscored by President Trump's declared intention to direct Venezuelan policymaking for an indefinite period, ostensibly until the country was stabilized sufficiently to restore oil production under the auspices of major US corporations such as Chevron, ExxonMobil, as well as ConocoPhillips. Now, when asked who was in charge of Venezuela's governance, Trump responded impatiently that we are in charge. There is more politically at stake in this drastic reversal of the US good neighbor policy associated with Latin American diplomacy since 1933 and the presidency of F.D. Roosevelt than initially meets even the most discerning eye. Now, of course, this tradition of cooperative relations was repeatedly undermined after the Castro Revolution in Cuba and Salvador Allende's electoral victory in Chile. Also, next up, we have to talk about this regime management this resource control as well as the return of imperial governance. You see, most informed observers, they assumed that the attack on Venezuela, it aimed at achieving regime change, installing Maria Corina Machado, an ardent advocate of US intervention and a long-time leader of the anti-Maduro opposition and a 2025 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, whose acceptance speech lavishly praised Donald Trump as the more deserving candidate. The most unexpected development of the intervention has been the bypassing of Mercado and the installation instead of Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as Venezuela's new president. Now, Washington claimed confidence that Rodriguez would cooperate with US interests, particularly in relation to Venezuelan oil as well as other resources, and restore stability on terms compatible with US priorities. Trump even declared that had Mercado declined the Nobel Prize on the grounds that he deserved it, she would have become Venezuela's president. Now, a more plausible explanation that we feel is that Mercado lacked sufficient domestic support to stabilize the country, whereas Rodriguez appeared willing to accommodate US economic demands, particularly those relating to control over Venezuela's resource wealth, while enjoying broader popular support. The pre-attack pro-democracy narrative promoted by US state propaganda, it gained limited credibility from this continuity of leadership, rather than a symbolic march into Caracas alongside Mercado to preside over her inauguration as Venezuela's new puppet leader. Yet, after meeting Trump on the 9th of January, what we see is that the executives of major US oil corporations, widely assumed to be the principal beneficiaries of this intervention, they expressed reservations about resuming operations, citing concerns over instability following the US takeover, right? So let us try to clarify relations between international law and global security. You see, fellas, this military operation in Venezuela, together with its political aftermath, it clearly violates international law, governing the use of force, as obviously authoritatively codified in the UN Charter. Yet even this apparently straightforward assessment, it contains a certain degree of ambiguity. The Charter's institutional design, while it privileges the 5 victorious powers of the Second World War, granting them permanent membership of the Security Council and an unrestricted veto. In effect, responsibility for managing global security, well, it was deliberately, I would say, entrusted to these states, which also became the first nuclear weapon powers, enabling any one of them to block Security Council action even when supported by a 14-1 majority. The Security Council, fellas, is the only political organ of the UN that is authorized to issue binding decisions, aside from the ICJ, obviously the International Court of Justice. The ICJ, however, it operates under voluntary jurisdiction, as states may withhold consent to what is known as compulsory jurisdiction. As a result, the management of global security has in practice been left to the discretion of the permanent 5, usually dominated by the United States or paralyzed by vetoes. In this sense, we feel that the Venezuelan operation, it should be understood less as signaling the collapse of international law than as an expression of nihilistic geopolitical management. If so, the appropriate remedy is not simply to strengthen international law, but to strip geopolitical actors of their self-assigned managerial role in global security. Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2022, it can be viewed similarly, a geopolitical failure shaped by irresponsible NATO provocations, culminating in Russia's own provoked yet egregious breach of Article 2(4). Also, what we feel is that the Venezuelan operation, it further erodes any residual confidence in the capacity of the permanent 5, and especially Trump's United States to manage peace, security, or genocide prevention. It thereby reinforces the need to consider alternative frameworks, either by curtailing the veto or by shifting security governance beyond the UN to counter hegemonic mechanisms, including BRICS, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and emerging South-South development frameworks. It must nevertheless, I would say, it must nevertheless be emphasized that international law, it remains indispensable and effective in most areas of cross-border interaction. Now, in domains such as diplomatic immunity, maritime and aviation safety, tourism and communication, negotiated legal standards are generally respected and disputes resolved peacefully. International law functions where reciprocity prevails, but has never constrained great power ambition in the domain of global security, where asymmetries of hard power tend to dominate. So, let's talk about the 2025 US national security strategy, which is basically nihilistic geopolitics. Now, to understand Venezuela's place within Trump's worldview, ladies and gentlemen, it is essential to examine the national security strategy of the United States that was released in November 2025. Trump's cover letter is suffused with narcissism and contempt for internationalism, including international law, multilateral institutions, and the UN. He proclaims, and I quote, "America is strong and respected again, and because of that, we are making peace all over the world," unquote. Such rhetoric, pathological in any ordinary individual, is alarming when issued by a leader who controls the use of nuclear weapons. Trump concludes by promising to make America, in his words, safer, richer, freer, greater, and more powerful than ever before. Now, the NSS, right, the National Security Strategy, it repeatedly invokes preeminence as the central objective of US foreign policy. To be pursued by any means necessary. The Venezuelan intervention appears as a sequel to US complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza and a possible prelude to further projects including control over Greenland and renewed military threats against Iran. Yet the document's primary focus is Latin America, framed through a revival of the Monroe Doctrine, now reinforced by the explicitly named Trump corollary, which was also colloquially dubbed as the Monroe Doctrine. This hemispheric turn, it abandons the post-Cold War ambition of global US leadership pursued by Obama and Biden, which consumed vast resources in failed state-building ventures in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Instead, it prioritizes resource extraction, securing oil, rare earths, and minerals with immense benefits for US corporations, while marginalizing NATO and abandoning multilateralism, underlying the recent US withdrawal from participation in 66 separate institutional entities, including the Climate Change Treaty. Now, Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves, with its strategic location and authoritarian populist government, it provided an ideal testing ground and conveniently diverted attention from Trump's personal entanglements with Jeffrey Epstein. In practical terms, the intervention resembles a coup rather than regime change, accompanied by an explicit demand that the new leadership take orders from Washington as the price of political survival. Trump and his Cuban exiled Secretary of State Marco Rubio openly linked Venezuela to future regime change efforts in Colombia and Cuba, with Trump issuing a crude threat to Colombian President Gustavo Petro and US forces repeatedly killing 32 Cuban members of Maduro's presidential guard. So finally, if we talk about the implications and the conclusion drawn from this narrative, we feel that it remains rather uncertain whether Delcy Rodriguez's government will negotiate an arrangement that preserves formal sovereignty while surrendering substantive control. We feel that such an outcome, it would signal an embrace of digital age gunboat diplomacy, reversing the UN principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources and reinstating a hierarchical hemispheric order. This vision even it contemplates the subordination of Canadian sovereignty to Washington's political and economic preferences. So also international reactions to the assault on Venezuela have been muted, reflecting fear, confusion, or perceived futility or hopelessness. Meanwhile, geopolitical rivalry intensifies, particularly with Russia and China, raising the specter of a new Cold War or nuclear conflict. The NSS, it makes clear that US preeminence requires excluding all extra-hemispheric powers from the region by its repeated referencing of our hemisphere. The Venezuelan episode, to conclude, therefore, exemplifies a broader strategy: the rejection of international law, the marginalization of the UN, and the unilateral assertion of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere, along with political intervention almost anywhere on the planet, but with immediate relevance to Greenland and Iran. Well, that'll be all for now, fellas. Thank you very much for tuning in, and please don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe. I'll be back with more enthralling videos on current affair agendas. Thank you very much. Stay blessed. God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum.